This year marks the 70th anniversary of the Korean Armistice Agreement. This war not only resulted in continued tension between North and South Korea to this day, but it also played a crucial role in shaping Taiwan's destiny. So, how exactly did the Korean War impact Taiwan? Let's discuss how the Korean War influenced Taiwan. Many of you may have learned in history class about the Armistice Agreement signed by North and South Korea in 1953, and this year marks its 70th anniversary. Although the guns have been silent for 70 years, technically, the Korean War has not officially ended. The Armistice Agreement was signed by military representatives from both sides, and the South Korean government did not have any representatives involved in the signing. As a result, North and South Korea are technically still in a state of war. Beyond the ongoing impact on inter-Korean relations, this war has had profound implications for global dynamics and surrounding countries, particularly the relationships between the United States, China, and Taiwan. The two major powers in today's world, the US and China, actually first confronted each other during the Korean War. It is said that prior to this conflict, the US government planned to abandon the Chiang Kai-shek government in Taiwan, but the war changed their attitude towards Taiwan. What exactly happened during this process? Why did the US change its stance? More specifically, how did the Korean War affect the situation in Taiwan? To understand how the outbreak of the Korean War influenced the situation in Taiwan, we need to look at the East Asian landscape from the late World War II to the early Cold War. Particularly the power struggle between the US and the Soviet Union. First, let's discuss the division of the Korean Peninsula. Before 1945, the Korean Peninsula was unified. The Allies had originally agreed that after the war, the peninsula would be temporarily occupied by Allied forces and then allowed to gain independence. However, both the US and the Soviet Union wanted to take control of Korea. Just hours before Japan's surrender, they began negotiations on how to jointly occupy the territory. According to US military officers involved in the discussions, under immense pressure and time constraints, they hastily drew the 38th parallel, a line that held no geographical or economic significance, to divide the Korean peninsula into two nearly equal territories. In the south, the US took control, while the Soviet Union occupied the north. After the war, both powers supported their respective Korean governments, leading to the establishment of the Republic of Korea and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which ultimately sowed the seeds for the later Korean War. However, before the two Koreas could clash, China experienced its own civil war, which also changed the US attitude toward the Kuomintang government. Originally, during World War II, the nationalists and communists had worked together, but after the war, despite attempts to negotiate a joint government, they ended up in conflict. The US and the Soviet Union each backed one side, providing resources without direct involvement. As a result, the communist forces gained ground while the KMT faced repeated defeats, putting the US government in a difficult position under domestic pressure. Eventually, the US concluded that the KMT's losses were due to internal corruption and inefficiency. So when the KMT retreated to Taiwan after their defeat, the US adopted a policy of watching from the sidelines, distancing itself from the nationalist government. In early 1950, the US government announced that American troops would not defend Taiwan, and the US consulate in Taiwan was already planning evacuation procedures for American citizens. Many analysts believe that the US was preparing to abandon the nationalist government. It was said that at that time, the Chinese Communist Party was secretly preparing coastal units to quickly seize Taiwan. Just when Taiwan's fate hung in the balance, the Korean War broke out. In June 1950, North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel in an attempt to unify the Korean peninsula, marking the start of the Korean War. The United Nations quickly passed a resolution declaring North Korea's actions an invasion and authorized a UN force, commanded by the US, to assist South Korea. Interestingly, the Soviet Union, which supported North Korea, could have used its veto power to block the resolution. But it chose to be absent and did not vote in protest of the UN's representation of China being the Republic of China rather than the People's Republic of China. When the US announced its military deployment to the Korean peninsula, it also declared a policy of neutralization of the Taiwan Strait to prevent the Chinese Communist Party from taking the opportunity to attack Taiwan. This brought Taiwan back into the scope of US military defense, and the 7th Fleet was dispatched to the Taiwan Strait. This Taiwan Strait neutralization policy greatly displeased the Chinese Communist Party, which believed that the US's earlier, watching from the sidelines, stance was disingenuous and suspected that the US might even support Chiang Kai-shek in launching a counteroffensive from Taiwan. However, while deploying troops to patrol Taiwan, the US also demanded that the Chiang Kai-shek government cease all military operations against the Communists. Many analysts believe that the intention behind this policy was merely to stabilize the situation in the Taiwan Strait temporarily, avoiding a scenario where US forces would be stretched thin between Korea and Taiwan. This was not about helping Chiang Kai-shek launch a counteroffensive against the mainland. In fact, Chiang had expressed multiple times his desire to participate in the Korean War, with plans to strike back at China from the Korean peninsula. However, these proposals were rejected by the US, indicating that the US likely did not want the conflict to escalate into the Taiwan Strait. This thinking may have also stemmed from their assessment that the situation in South Korea was not very optimistic and required significant US support. MacArthur's counteroffensive. In the early stages of the war, South Korea was indeed facing continuous setbacks. Although supported by US-led United Nations forces, the main troops needed time to mobilize, so initially, South Korea had to rely on its own forces. However, the South Korean military was no match for the North Koreans. After about 2 months of fighting, North Korea had captured around 90% of the Korean peninsula. In response, the US decided to deploy a large force. In mid-September 1950, under MacArthur's command, a United Nations force primarily composed of US Marines landed at Incheon, strategically located in the center of the North Korean occupied area. They successfully coordinated with the southern forces to encircle the North Korean troops, turning the tide of the war. In just half a month, they regained the territory that had originally belonged to South Korea and continued to push northward across the 38th parallel, aiming to eliminate the communist regime on the Korean peninsula. A month after the Incheon landing, they captured Pyongyang. However, at this point, something unexpected happened. China intervened by sending troops to join the fight. China's intervention and Allied setbacks. In fact, China had initially warned that if the United Nations crossed the 38th parallel, they would send troops to support North Korea. According to later declassified documents, the US assessed that there was no benefit for China in intervening in Korea, leading them to believe that China was merely making threats. However, when the UN forces crossed the 38th parallel, China secretly mobilized a large number of People's Volunteer Army troops to cross the Yalu River into Korea to aid North Korea. The UN forces, caught off guard due to a lack of intelligence and preparation, suffered significant setbacks. Estimates later suggested that around 2 million Chinese troops participated in the conflict. A staggering number that helped compensate for the equipment disparity and resulted in a stalemate in the Korean War. Why was China so eager to assist North Korea? Some analysts point out that China was concerned that if the US defeated North Korea, their next target could be an invasion of China from the Korean peninsula. Additionally, China sought to increase its international influence by supporting North Korea. However, after nearly a year of fighting, the war reached a stalemate, and both sides faced their own problems. China had suffered nearly 1 million casualties due to coastal tactics, while internal divisions emerged within the US government. President Truman was reluctant to escalate the conflict, while MacArthur advocated for increased troop deployments to attack China. Ultimately, MacArthur was relieved of his command, and both sides began to scale down their military operations and pursue peace negotiations. After 2 years of negotiations, in late July 1953, both North and South Korea finally signed an armistice agreement at Panmunjom, maintaining the 38th parallel as the dividing line between the two regimes. This experience of engaging with China led the U.S. to re-evaluate its Taiwan Strait policy. Originally, the U.S. felt relatively confident about the Korean War, especially after the Incheon landing, believing they could successfully drive the communist regime out of the Korean peninsula. They did not anticipate the emergence of the Chinese Communist Party as a significant player, which led the U.S. to reassess its strategy in East Asia. They realized that the strength of the Chinese Communist forces was greater than they had initially thought, and to prevent the spread of communism, Taiwan held significant strategic value. To ensure stability in Taiwan, the U.S. signed the Mutual Defense Treaty with the Chiang Kai-shek government in 1954. Continuing the cooperative defense established during the Korean War and increasing military aid. The standoff across the Taiwan Strait has persisted to this day. Beyond military support, the U.S. also provided substantial economic aid until the mid-1960s. This assistance first helped Taiwan navigate the severe post-war inflation and later provided necessary funding for economic transformation. Additionally, to ensure that the aid was effectively utilized, the U.S. sent advisors to guide various industries in Taiwan. Of course, while U.S. financial support contributed to Taiwan's development, it also indirectly bolstered Chiang Kai-shek's regime. Furthermore, this aid was not free. Taiwan only fully repaid its last dollar loan in 2004. I remember learning in history class about the significant impact of the Korean War on Taiwan. However, while gathering this information, I uncovered more details and historical nuances, particularly about how different histories are intertwined and influence one another. Today's discussion primarily focused on how the conflict between North and South Korea affected Taiwan, but from the perspectives of the Koreas, if it weren't for the Chinese Civil War. The situation in the Korean War could have been entirely different. For example, if the nationalists had won the Chinese Civil War, would the Chinese Communist Party have still been able to launch a mass troop strategy to support North Korea? Or, hypothetically, if the Chinese Civil War hadn't occurred and a unified communist government had emerged, would the US and the Soviet Union have tried to prevent conflict between the two regimes on the Korean peninsula, perhaps collaborating instead? This suggests that the outcome of the Chinese Civil War, leading to the nationalists retreating to Taiwan, set the stage for the Korean War's trajectory, which in turn impacted Taiwan. Recognizing these intertwined influences helps us better understand the origins of current events. However, it seems that these mutual influences often hinge on the power struggles between major nations, sometimes directly rooted in changes in their policies or intentions. The Korean War didn't directly affect Taiwan, rather, it was the backdrop of the US-Soviet Cold War that changed U.S. perceptions of the East Asian situation, leading to a shift in their Taiwan Strait policy, which then influenced Taiwan's historical development. Whether in Korea or Taiwan, the fate of smaller nations being swayed by the dynamics of larger powers is a point of frustration. Finally, we'd like to ask everyone. From the U.S. perspective, after China entered the Korean War, would you advocate for taking on China like MacArthur, or would you prefer to avoid escalating the conflict like Truman? I side with MacArthur because at that time, China was no match for the US and we could quickly secure the Korean peninsula. I would prefer not to escalate the conflict, especially since China has the Soviet Union backing it, it could lead to World War III. I wouldn't have intervened at all, the costs of World War II were so severe, why resort to war to resolve differences? Other. Share your thoughts in the comments. Lastly, If you enjoyed today's video, please share it so more people can learn about the impact of the Korean War on Taiwan. You can also click here to explore discussions on Korean reunification and North Korean defectors. That wraps up today's session, and we'll see you again tomorrow night.